Hello? Hello? Hey, I heard you were in the market for a new DAC.
Well, maybe, but what the hell are you doing in my basement?
I'm HoloAudio Spring 3 Kitsune Tuned Edition. Kitsune means fox in Japanese, and that's me.
Okay, I'm gonna call the police.
Whoa, wait, hold on. Just hear me out. I mean, literally. I sound good.
It says here that your design is over 3 years old. You came out in 2021. Is that correct?
So, remind me, how old is the majority of music that you listen to? Catch that new Drake album? Brand spanking new.
Fair point.
I know, right?
Okay, but there's so many DACs that I wanted to check out, There's just so much hype surrounding many of them, and I don't know.
Well, I think you'll find that I stand up to those quite favorably. I've got a remote.
Oh, come to me, baby. And this is the HoloAudio Spring 3 KTE. Now, I know this DAC has been around for a while, but when I reviewed its much smaller, newer, and more affordable little brother, the Cyan 2, I had to see what happens when you go up a level. Is it worth the extra scratch? Can it scratch the DAC FOMO itch that you guys may be having? Stick around and find out. This is going to be a fun one. All right, I'm just going to come out and say it. This thing's pure audio rack jewelry. A visually stunning DAC, in my opinion, of course. The Spring 3 is also really well built, similar to the Cyan 2, but larger, heavier, and seemingly more premium. The chassis is made from this thick aluminum, and the DAC weighs 8.5 kilograms, which is heavy but manageable. On the front panel, we've now got orange metal buttons and a large digital display, both of which are welcome additions. The display is a bright dot matrix and comfortably legible from faraway distances. I like that Holo gives you the option to turn it off through the remote control if you find it at all distracting. On the top, we've got this little cool copper fox logo that you only get ordering the maxed out KTE version that I'm reviewing today. That means you can also order the Spring in less expensive variations, which is great. The remote is small and made up of the same outer materials as the DAC itself. The infrared sensor is nicely implemented and works really well in my experience. The remote buttons, as you can hear, they rattle. And unfortunately, it's missing a power button, so it's basically used to switch inputs, toggle display, and control volume. Now, that's something else I should mention. So this version of the Spring 3 came with a $600 preamp add-on. For the money that you spend, it actually adds quite a bit of versatility here. First off, it's not done digitally like with other DACs. It's a fully discrete and balanced relay preamp. So it's similar to Holo's own Serene, which is a preamplifier only model. So you won't experience any loss in fidelity the way that you would lowering and raising digital volume on other DACs that you may have tried. It's a real analog preamp. This comes in handy for level matching while comparing with other DACs with different input levels, so I could basically go back and forth faster without having to adjust the volume on my amp. Also, and this may be specific to my headphone setup, but I sit more than arm's length away from my headphone amp, the GSX Mini. Now that amp doesn't have a remote control, but here I am now able to use the Spring 3's remote to control volume. Now, since I take no hit in audio quality, it's a total win. The main benefit though, should you have a standalone amp, you have a very capable preamp built right in. This may be a no-brainer for future-proofing. The only possible downside is, unlike the Serene preamplifier, the Spring 3's preamp accepts digital inputs only, so no analog inputs. For me, that's totally fine because, as many of you know, I'm a digital pleb. Should you have the Spring 3 connected to something like an integrated amplifier and want to totally disconnect the preamp, simply turn the DAC's volume to 94 and it totally disengages, which is pretty great.
Now, before we get any further into the video, I'd like to have a chat with you guys about my initial experience with this DAC. Reason being, it was a bit of a surprise.
I'm just collecting my thoughts here. I did not expect the Spring 3 KTE to sound this damn good right out the gate. So the Cyan 2 that I had before this one, it did not sound this good right out the gate. And I don't know if that's indicative of contextually, it was delivered in the dead of winter and it was cold and it just didn't sound right. But when I came back, 2 hours later, it sounded, really nice. This Spring 3 KTE sounded just like it's been burning in for a couple days, just right out the gate. I'm really curious to see if it's going to sound even better. This is fresh from the factory, and I don't know if they do any type of burn-in like other companies do. That'd be a question for Tim at KitsuneHiFi. But regardless of all that, okay, let's talk about the song. So the track it must have been really well recorded. It's a jazz track. I recommend you guys to check it out. Check out the whole album. I'm excited to do so after I shoot this little video. But holy balls, the soundstage, I was in a massive auditorium and it was a real orchestra just playing in front of me, and I was so blown away by how this sounded, how live this sounded right out the gate. The trumpets, just everything was so dynamic and everything had its own pocket, all the telltales of a good DAC. The separation was amazing. The image was just, pardon my French, it was incredible. And the soundstage was like massive, as I said earlier. So I don't know. I'm sure you can tell, I'm really excited about just how this thing is going to sound after, a couple hours and a couple days of burn-in. Is it going to change? I don't see it getting much better than this. Like, how could it? I'm blown away. I'm really taken back.
The more I listened, the more I was impressed. But it turns out this wasn't the Spring at its best. Seriously. Since this was a brand new unit, burn-in had to be taken under consideration. So I got an email from Tim at KitsuneHiFi explaining that due to the upgraded components, Spring 3 is actually less sensitive to burn-in than Cyan 2, but will sound its absolute best after 500 hours of running. So we had a long way to go. Keep in mind, if I had to judge sound quality at that point, Spring 3 would have already gotten really high marks. But straight from the fox's mouth, it's supposed to improve. How? I couldn't tell you, but Google did the math, and that's a really long freaking time.
So right off the bat, I noticed something weird while using optical from my TV over to the Spring 3. I'll show you guys a little demo of what I'm talking about. Pay attention to the screen here. You see how audio just cut out and it says locking? It's going to come back. 48K again, and we hear sound. But that's not the end of it. There it goes again, locking, sound cutout. Now it's back again. There it goes again. That's probably the last time it'll happen, but you get my drift. So initially, I thought that this was a defect or I was doing something incorrectly, but it turns out that's not the case at all. This is actually the Holo Spring 3's phase lock loop, or PLL, zeroing in on a cleaner optical signal. Now, some of you can feel this detracting from your overall experience and could view this as a possible con, but for those of you that feel that way, don't worry about it. You could actually turn off PLL in the Spring's menu, so no big deal there. But I'm going to go ahead and convince you to keep it on. But first, in order to better understand what's going on here, let's have a quick chat about jitter.
Master Sir, I heard Mr. Chibbs talking about jitter. I've been wondering, what is jitter?
Well, young fake Anakin, jitter refers to slight irregular movements in the signal. You may know it as one of the inherent cons in using optical, but let's go a bit further here. Toslink-based digital audio sources like the one I use for my TV send audio signals as light pulses to the DAC. This is done through fiber cables. Now, inside that cable, light travels multiple paths. Ideally, you want that light to go directly down the center of the length of the cable's fiber to its destination, sort of like a laser. Some of that light does actually behave that way, but other bits spread out and take a more indirect bouncy path along the length of the cable, sort of like my morning peas. Now, this makes those stray bits of light arrive later than the ones that took the direct path. Since the more delayed light is still carrying the same information as the direct light, it causes timing inaccuracies, which actually distorts your audio. Oh, So how do we get rid of jitter? PLL. The main purpose of a phase lock loop circuit is to synchronize an output oscillator signal with a reference signal. Let me explain. The optical signal that your DAC would normally receive actually gets looped back into something called a phase detector. That same phase detector also has a reference signal running into its other input. It compares the difference between them and compensates for that offset. When the phase difference between the two signals is 0, the system becomes locked, and as a result, the output oscillator now mirrors that reference signal. So to put it simply, those timing issues are now compensated for, which gets rid of jitter. It's okay. We're good. Oh, we're good. So the Spring 3's PLL implementation provides you with almost zero jitter, not only in the optical port, but all other ports as well. So those of you with potato sources, don't even worry about it. You're gonna notice improvements running through this thing. I certainly did, playing Xbox, streaming from the Wii Pro, even watching YouTube videos. This is just really cool. So if you're like me and you don't just play music through your audio system, you use it more like a multimedia hub, the Spring 3 is insanely good to just having everything connected to. Seriously, watching videos and playing Xbox just sounds way better. More to the point, when I took the Spring out of my office system to test down here in my main setup, I just really missed that fidelity. In that sense, it's just such a versatile DAC. All that, and we haven't even begun to discuss the Spring's USB implementation, so let's do that now.
I chose to review the KTE version of the Spring 3. I'm not going to lie, it was partially because of the little copper fox on the top, but even more importantly for its upgraded USB module. It's the same part that they use on the higher-end Holo DAC, and it's supposed to be among the best in the business. Now, I was already impressed with the Cyan 2 running straight out of my computer. This is supposed to be even better, and you know what? That pretty much tracks. I don't see any point in adding a DDC to this DAC. The SU6 does nothing in between my M1 Mac Mini and the Spring 3 KTE. There's no perceptible benefit, not even going to the DAC's I2S port. The SU6 is completely wasted in this scenario. If you're streaming from a computer, just use any old USB cable and you're golden. So after what felt like a whole eternity, the 500 hours of burn-in were finally complete. Did it sound better than when I first received the Spring? Honestly, I couldn't tell you, but I did really like what I was hearing. So in order to get the full experience this go around, I decided it was time to download and test out HQ Player. This software is very powerful, but not so much user-friendly, especially at first. If you're a plug-and-play type and adverse to menus and sub-menus and sub-sub-menus, this won't be an easy trip for you. Having said that, I think it's still worth the work and aggravation for what it actually does to your music. It took me about 3 days and a lot of trial and error to get it working properly in my system. Totally worth it though, because now I know HQ. Oversampling through my M1 Mac Mini, I'm able to go up to DSD 256 with things still running smoothly. Quick note on DSD playback, the Spring 3 has a genuine 1-bit DSD converter, separate from its R2R ladder. This is a total win for the Spring because both native and upsampled DSD just sounds amazing on this DAC. Most other DACs, my Denafrips Venus 2 included, are capable of decoding DSD, but that's not done natively. Those DACs actually convert DSD to PCM, and from there it just goes up the DAC's R2R ladder. Simply put, the Spring 3 does DSD natively and beautifully, while most other DACs do not. Now, how does HQ Player make things sound? After going back and forth quite a lot, I found out it's like having a totally different DAC. Oversampling gives me better imaging, clarity, and dynamics with a wider soundstage. Now, you would think that that would make it a clear winner, but non-oversampling while having a more narrow soundstage just sounds smoother. It gives off this rich and butter smooth tonality. Not as detailed in the highs though, they seem to be more rolled off. But that's not at all a bad thing in my view. So going back and forth, I couldn't say I consistently liked one over the other. On some tracks, I definitely preferred OS, and on others, NOS. I could see myself setting up OS through HQ Player and just leaving it there. Conversely, I'm able to leave it on non-oversampling, not have to deal with all that software, and enjoy those NOS benefits. So yeah, it really is two DACs in one in this regard. Neither choice is wrong. I just have to ask myself, what am I in the mood for today? For those of you that have both options available to you, I'm genuinely curious. Do you switch back and forth a lot or just leave it on one? Let me know in the comments. On tracks where I preferred the way oversampling rendered, the Spring 3 running through HQ Player was top of the pack. It sounded bigger, better dynamics, separation, and stage. Surprisingly more impressive than the Venus 2, which took second place on those specific tracks. Keep in mind, all three were great to listen to, and if I wasn't ABCing, I would have been happy with any of these configs. Honestly, at this stage, it's like choosing which supercar to drive. On tracks like this one, I preferred the singer's voice in non-oversampling. It felt more forward, realistic, and I just connected with it more than I did from HQ Player or through the Venus. And then we get to this Valkyrie track. I literally spent hours on it just obsessing. For the most part, HQ Player was tops, except NOS was more preferable when the woman sings her ho-ho tohos. I zeroed in on the ho-ho tohos and kept switching in between all three configurations. I felt like a ho-ho toho-ho. NOS was my favorite there, but the stage and instruments were not as big as they were with HQ Player. Still enjoyable though. Stage is wider on the Venus 2, but not quite at the level that HQ Player gave me, and also not as resolving, which was pretty crazy. At that point, I was wondering, with my Venus being the amazing DAC that it is, why it hadn't been at the top of the pack yet. I thought perhaps it might be the way that I had it connected. You see, I normally run a DDC out of the Lumen U2 Mini so I could utilize its I2S port, arguably the best port on that DAC. Now I want to mention that the Spring 3 was just connected straight to my computer using a USB cable, so I thought I was on equal footing, but maybe not. So for science, I went and grabbed the Singzer DDC and hooked it up to the Lumen Venus chain, this time using I2S. While I felt there was a marginal improvement in that chain, it was still just not as impressive as the HQ Player Spring 3 combo. I gotta say that HQ Player upconverting and oversampling is really something amazing. Does it make me want to give up the Venus and just get a DAC that does DSD natively? No, not really. I mean, apart from being somewhat difficult and confusing to set up, HQ Player adds a significant delay. You don't notice it if you're just playing an album, but if you're like me and you're playing certain parts of a song, like Ho-Ho Tohos, or just switching to a new track, it takes a while to pad out. Furthermore, it requires a rather powerful PC to run, especially upconverting to DSD-256. Now, in retrospect, I was pretty lucky that I picked 16 gigs of RAM instead of 8 back when I originally bought my M1 Mac Mini, because it just scrapes by in this regard. I have another Windows PC that's probably up to the task, but that thing has really loud fans, unlike the M1 Mac Mini. With the Venus, I could just leave it in oversampling mode and it just does its job without much fuss. Now, I could have the Spring 3 KTE connected and just use non-oversampling in that same regard. It's just as easy and tonally seems to be the best of the bunch. Again, this just comes down to preference. It's nice to have options. I decided to install the Spring 3 KTE into my main listening room to see how it performed with better gear. The DAC did really well here in NOS mode. Even though it was tucked away behind my behemoth Cornwall, the remote's infrared still worked perfectly. Now, I wasn't set up for HQ Player down there, but remembered that the Lumen has upsampling as well. So for the first time with that streamer, I turned it on to upsample everything to DSD-256. Now, it had a similar effect as using HQ Player. I'm not sure it's as good or made as much of a difference as what HQ Player does, but it's a viable option, and upsampling worked with less of a delay. Additionally, this was way easier to set up, which is a major plus for those of you that just don't want the hassle. It's the same mixed bag as to whether or not I preferred oversampling or NOS mode, though. In a track where the focus is less on the singer like this one and more instrumental, I slightly preferred the upsampled version. On the album Moondial, where it was a more intimate recording, just a acoustic guitarist, going back and forth, every track went to non-oversampling. It just felt richer in tonality and came across more true to life. And again, more complex recording, like this version of Here Comes the Sun, just wowed me upscaled in DSD-256. In either case, the Spring 3 plays well in my main sandbox.
All right, let's start with the cons. Now, this list of cons are mostly nitpicks, honestly, and things that I hope Holo considers changing in future iterations. I'm going to stress the term nitpick here because none of them are at all deal breakers by any means. So, first off, no integrated OS. As wonderfully fantastic as HQ Player is, I really like the uncomplicatedness of just having onboard oversampling when I'm in the mood for it. So adding integrated OS would help with lazy plebs like me that don't mind taking a bit of a hit on oversampling quality. Next, the remote, the buttons. Maybe add some rubber gaskets. Since we're talking about the remote, I've got a bone to pick with its power button. Basically, it's non-existent. Besides changing inputs and controlling volume, powering on and off is one thing you definitely want your remote to do. Now, just quickly pressing the power button on the DAC itself does not toggle the power. You need to actually press and hold for a bit in either case. I prefer a quick press. Maybe there's a good reason for this, but I honestly can't think of any. Let me know in the comments below if you guys understand why they would do that. I get the feeling Holo just wants you to keep the thing on and running at all times, and this is primarily what I've been doing. Having the preamp turn off at 94 is something you just have to know and remember. I would like it in a future iteration if the preamp had its own power toggle switch. Perhaps Holo could do a firmware update so when the volume is set to 94 it actually says preamp off, just so we get a visual confirmation. Remembering numbers is definitely not my strong suit, and I'm sure I'm not alone with this. The next one, the green power light. While it's not bright or distracting in any way, I just don't like green LEDs, okay? Totally reaching here, but making it light up white, purple, or even the objectively best LED color ever, magenta, would be so much cooler. Why don't more manufacturers do this? Now, on the pros side of things, this list was much easier to make, mainly because there's a lot to gush about here. I've sort of been doing that this whole video, but here's the quick list. The screen is useful, legible from a distance, and can be turned off. I'm a huge fan of this. Included remote for the lazies. Aesthetics. This DAC is pure audio rack jewelry. It stands out as something that you spent a lot of money on, but in a tasteful, unobtrusive sort of way. Build quality. Enough said. The optional preamp is useful. You can have it hooked up to 2 amps at once using both XLR and RCAs. Sound quality is stellar with real, actual non-oversampling. If you're after a smooth, rich, and tonally beautiful experience, just go with NOS. It's that simple. You get DSD natively with Spring 3's separate 1-bit DSD converter. If you want to use oversampling and don't mind a little bit of legwork, you get the full experience, and impressively so, using HQ Player. Galvanically isolated, very well performing USB. And finally, phase lock loop is frickin' great. All potato digital sources are not only welcomed, but improved upon by the Spring 3. So the whole impetus to doing this review was the stellar impression that the Cyan 2 left me with. To be honest, I almost bought that DAC. I was like this close. So was it sound quality that I thought was lacking? No, not at all. On that front, the Cyan was more than adequate for me. The main reason I didn't buy that DAC was specific to my use case. To put it bluntly, I want to be able to switch inputs at will, and for that, I need buttons and ideally a remote control. The Spring 3 has me covered there, while also offering some other welcome creature comforts, like the preamp, like the screen so I could better see what's going on. But another big one I didn't anticipate was its phase lock loop, or PLL. This takes potato digital sources and just makes them so much better. It ends up being a pretty big improvement from the Cyan and pretty much every other DAC that I've used. This can't be understated. So now, is the Spring 3 sound quality better than the Cyans? While I don't have it here for a direct comparison, I still believe it is, yes. Now, if I use a quality digital source like my Lumen U2 Mini, I'm guessing that that difference in sound quality narrows. But having both DACs and both systems for the months that I've used them, this is the conclusion that I'm at. The Spring 3 is in fact a better all-around DAC. From a value perspective, the Spring 3 KTE is actually a pretty great deal. Being able to run directly out of a computer and give you beautifully clean audio is something to behold. The PLL from all sources for that matter works to the same effect. Don't have a computer to directly stream from, just buy a cheap Weem Pro, run it coax, run it optical, and profit. Now, in the main system that I built, I've got the Lumen U2 Mini connected to a Singzer SU6 DDC feeding my Denafrips Venus 2 DAC. But the Spring 3 KTE removes any need for the Uber streamer in DDC. And you know what? Of course it does. This is just what a good DAC should do. Simply convert digital to analog. And at its very core, the Spring 3 does this really well. You shouldn't have to be restricted by using an expensive streamer and then going that extra mile adding a DDC just so you could use I2S in order to get the best sound out of your DAC. Just taking a step back and putting what I said into perspective, that's batshit crazy. Don't get me wrong, I really do like my main setup and the way that it sounds, but looking back, it was a convoluted mess of a rabbit hole that I went down to get there. Now, had I traveled down a foxhole instead and bought the Spring 3, I would have saved a lot of money in that process. Perhaps that difference could have been used to purchase the higher-end HoloAudio May. But that, my friends, is another video. Maybe. In any case, the Spring 3 beats what I use now in almost every single use case. It gives me something special in the way that it renders with NOS while leaving the option wide open for oversampling, and not to mention it decodes DSD natively. It may not be the value king that the Cyan 2 is, but it improves on that DAC's limitations while being a more fleshed out, better sounding bit of kit. And that's valuable to me. So, you want my conclusion? You already heard it. The Spring 3 is the DAC that you guys probably should have already bought. It's been out for years and was right under our noses all along. It's a well-made, incredibly versatile, good-looking, great-sounding DAC with features that make it really easy to live with. So the HoloAudio Spring 3 KTE gets my Gold Standard Award and comes highly recommended from this channel. I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.